Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am delighted to be joined today by Dan Allender and Cathy Loerzel. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hey, we did that pretty duet. I like that. That's the closest I've ever come to singing with you.
We always have more time, Dan.
The melody of today's episode is going to be story. I've asked you to come on to talk about story. You've been here before talking about story, but let's start with the most obvious question. Dan, I'll ask you, what do we mean when we say your story?
Well, just to start with the fact that we don't look at mere facts, brute reality, that our brain is constantly bringing some degree of order to everything that's happening around us and everything that's happening within us. So in that sense, our efforts to come to meaning, not just explanation as to why did X occur, but what is the meaning? It is the most elemental core part of who we are as human beings. So from that, what we can say is we are trying to make sense of the world, and mere facts never suffice. We are story bound, and therefore we're looking at time and space, we're looking at people, we're looking at dialogue, and we're looking at the movement of a plot in regarding every portion of our lives. So at least the beginning is we are meaning-making, storytelling, story-hearing people.
Cathy, when you hear him say story bound, what does that stir in you?
Well, one, I get mad because don't all of us want to be able to be removed something from the stories that are within our bodies? I find myself constantly at war with the fact that I know that I am bound to the stories that have made me me. And there are times where I'm furious that I can't escape these stories that I can't seem to heal. I can't seem to overcome. They keep haunting me. And so there are times in my own life where I feel trapped and have to kind of make peace and to say, what do I do with these stories that seem to be replaying themselves over and over in my life that I would rather ignore and just move on from, but that does not seem to be an option.
And in that verb replaying, I mean, the implication is that there is a linkage between your present lived experience today and your growing up years. Yes?
Yes. What
words would you put to why that linkage is and what it looks like?
So this just happened to me this weekend. I'm at a conference and I'm starting to have a difficult conversation with dear friends, and I can feel myself being triggered. I can feel myself having familiar feelings in my body. And what it felt like was this, like you're driving down a highway and the last time you were on that highway, you got into an accident. And you're going down the highway and you're on it and you're like, I feel afraid. I feel scared. And all you can think about is the fact that the last time you're on this highway, you got into an accident and you're trying your hardest not to get into the same accident that you did in the beginning. And so I think for me, when I look at story and being story bound and them replaying, it's like we have neural pathways that were created from original experiences. And now every time we go down a similar path, we're reminded in our bodies and our minds subconsciously that bad things happen here. And so our bodies are re-experiencing, like my body was re-experiencing past trauma in a moment where current trauma wasn't necessarily happening, but my body was terrified that the same thing that happened last time would happen again. And that's when Dan says story bound, it's like so my job can't be to just try to avoid that highway for the rest of my life. I have to figure out, how do I reconcile and manage a body that has a memory of bad things happening, but now I'm going down the same highway again and I'm having to manage myself and say, okay, I don't have to hit that tree this time, but my whole body is anticipating hitting the tree. And sometimes you actually do swerve because you're focused on the tree. we often have things that happen to us when we're young. They imprint in us, and we don't quite know how to handle ourselves later when they replay themselves. So a lot of the work that we're doing is to help ourselves manage the highways that have been built before our present context.
And so, Dan, if we are story bound, if there's a sense in which each one of the listeners is driving down the highway of their life, and that highway is not only going somewhere, but it's coming from somewhere. Like I think of God's question to Hagar, where have you come from? Where are you going? There's that highway, and it's both ways. It goes back to our families of origin. If that's all true, what do you mean by the hope of engaging one's story? What does it mean to engage one's story, and why is that a hopeful proposition?
Well, let's go back to the word bound, and really is related to the word bond. What Cathy's describing is what most of us live with, and that's a sense of bondage. And yet we're meant to be bonded. Our stories bond us to one another. We connect to one another through our stories. We connect to ourselves through our stories. To get even more granular, the left and the right hemispheres of our brain are connected through the process neurologically of a story that's being told between our hemispheres. So our being is enstoried and embodied. But again, the tragedy, and I think, Cathy, you've described it so well, we feel bound or bondage to certain stories where there isn't a freedom. There isn't the kind of capacity to not only not be bound, but actually to have come to bless, a difficult word. We don't bless past harm, but we bless what we can become in the face of past harm. So I really want us to stick with bondage or bonding. Those are really essentially the only two options. But most people don't feel in bondage until they get triggered. And then they try to escape that by going around it rather than entering into it. Back to the word engage. So if we're willing to step into what feels like bondage, I'm not going to say that it is simple nor easy. At times, it's convoluted and really heartbreaking. But there is a sense in which the three of us are not bound to past stories as we might have been even 5 or 10 years ago. And that's incredibly hopeful. I mean, it's spoken in terms of like neuroplasticity, but I think it's also fun to say repentance, defined as engaging our story with a kindness that comes from being beloved, opens the door to a new kind of bonding rather than what feels so heartbreaking, and that is bondage.
Cathy, what's that move? How's that move you?
I love the invitation to believe that where we once found ourselves in bondage, we can move to bonding. I think that feels really tender to me. And I think that's true. Stories that we've hated, we then find it, is the very story that has gotten us to understand more of love, more of connection, more of how to be with one another, how to be with ourselves. I love that. And I also can feel that the invitation and the war of what will you choose? And if you don't engage the story, then you in essence choose to be in bondage because you're not actually willing to slow it down and actually understand what the stories that are in our bodies are telling us.
Mm-hmm.
And as a starting point for this invitation to engage, what we call engage your story, I want to read something that you said, Dan, and then ask you about it, especially the last sentence. Here's what you wrote. Our own life is the thing that most influences and shapes our outlook, our tendencies, and our decisions. It is the force that orients us toward the future, and yet we don't give it a second thought, much less a careful examination. And then here's the sentence. that you end with. It's time to listen to our own story. Now, what I love about that last sentence is the verb listen. It's time to listen to our own story. If that is the beginning of engaging, what does it mean to listen to your story? Because the implication, of course, Dan, in your words, if I'm hearing them right, is that your story, that is your past, is somehow speaking to you now.
The reality is we've got over 3 billion neurons that configure in constant overlapping in a way that almost gives the meaning to the word infinite. So we have images, sensations, smells, memories of being 4, 8, 12, et cetera, et cetera. And the more significant trauma, it imprints, as Cathy used that verb, in our brain in a way that to tend to it feels like we're going to feel some of the same level of heartache and trauma. So the idea that what most of us do is to work to erase our past and to erase our sense of being as an 8-year-old or 12-year-old. Or if erasure doesn't seem possible, there are certainly other avenues like distractions or addictions or just plain being busy. So all the reality of what if you were to listen? And if we bring another reality here, what if there's a God who actually, through the Spirit, invites us to hear what we're not ready to hear yet we know is actually being spoken? That puts us in a really interesting position that to hear God, we need to be able to hear our own heart and mind. So our spirit is connected to the Spirit of God. To hear our own spirit ache. So when the psalmist says, "Oh, my soul, why are you downcast within me?" The psalmist is talking to himself, and he's saying, "I need to talk to you, soul, and you need to speak." And because there is this sense of disintegration within me, and I long to be whole. So that becomes the framework to being able to say, I live my story, but most of my most significant traumas, I don't want to remember. I don't remember. They're scantily present without being actually compelling. So to listen requires time. It requires a kind of leaning toward that allows us to be able to say there's so much more about us than we know, let alone those who are around us.
And for either one of you, and if I can answer, I'll answer. How have we grown in listening to our story? Cathy, how have you grown in listening to your story?
The primary place that I've been growing lately is by listening to what my body is telling me about what's going on in my story. I love using my mind, and I can get down to the heart, often, but to get down to my gut and to actually let my gut instinct, the part of me that knows things that I don't want to acknowledge, as I've learned to listen all the way down and to trust that if my body is vibrating, something is happening. Something is getting, some sort of trauma is getting triggered. Some story is getting brought up that hasn't had enough tending to that I need to go back to. And so what I've started to do is allow it to kind of bubble up from my gut and to come up and then engage all the way up where I can then say, okay, I think I understand what's going on. And as I do that, it's more easy for me to connect to the actual stories that I have put into exile, the parts of me that I have disintegrated from, the parts of me that I don't want to see or know, or the parts of my stories that haven't got a lot of tending to. If I can listen and trust that my body is telling me something that I need to listen to, and that that's connected to a place where I haven't had care or freedom or connection with other people. And as I have listened to that, massive parts of my story that I have not wanted to look at, or even the way my style of relating to the world that I haven't wanted to engage, those things have started to come up, and I've been able to slow myself down, take a break, and then say, okay, something's happening that I need to pay attention to. And and it's not enough to just think about it. I need to feel it and then sort it out through my body and through the sensation and then through my mind.
And Dan, as you hear her open up this category of listening to your story via listening to your body, how have you experienced that?
Well, I was standing in front of our refrigerator and said to Becky, "We have nothing to eat." And she said, "Oh, we have a lot to eat." And I said, "Look at the refrigerator. It's empty." She came over and began pointing out the evening's dinner, and then tomorrow evening's dinner, and a number of other, shall we say, options for food. And again, when you listen to your body, you can listen to, in one sense, the dis-ease of the body, the ambivalence, but you can also listen to the anxiety. And I was feeling anxious. But the way I metabolize anxiety is to blame. Becky's looking at me, and at one point, in the midst of this unpleasant conflict, she says, "You have a food insecurity." And I understand the words, but had never made the application of that phrase to me. And I, shall we say, made her pay for telling a truth I did not want to hear. But my wife is very deft at being able to handle my putative blows. And she just sort of goes, "Well, you did grow up in a crack house, and your mother fixed food that made you nauseous, and your best meal ever was a Swanson TV dinner." So she had the data of my story that's able to step me into, oh my God, I've not really named that every evening meal was an anticipation of disaster. So what I was reflecting in the midst of opening the refrigerator wasn't the reality just that it was somewhat empty, but not much. But I was reacting, as Cathy has put it so well, to something triggering me that I have a real bondage to, but I've never even named. So in engaging our body, being triggered, being angry, where it doesn't feel honoring, appropriate, consistent with who you are, who you wish to be, those are the moments where, back to that phrase, will we listen? And in this case, I wasn't so much listening to my body, but listening to the one who knows me best on this earth and letting my wife speak my story, invite me to my story, because none of us, oh, I say this with great confidence, none of us easily step into our own story without having an interpreter. In many ways, a story guide that gives us at least a perspective that we may not be willing to hold on our own.
So if the invitation to engage one's story is necessarily an invitation to ponder and reflect on the evening dinner table in your home, 6 years old, 8 years old, 18 years old, if our family of origin is still influencing who we are today, what would you say to the person that says, okay, that sounds intriguing to me, but I don't remember very much from my growing up years?
We all make deductions every single day. You know, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and today has been what they call the pineapple current, dumping more rain than we've had for a long time. And, I made the deduction, I'm going to get soaking wet even in my 15-minute commute from my house to my garage office. So I dressed in a way that took into account. A lot of us just need to do deductive work. We may not remember, but we can begin by asking the question, if you had a really angry mother who always made you pay in some form, and a father who would refuse to step in and bring some level of order or kindness, then you may not remember the meal, but do you remember some of her favorite phrases that she used when she wanted to make someone pay? Again, it sounds like historical fiction, but in so many ways, our memory is an effort to deduce from certain of the facts, certain of the things we do know. So you always move from what you do know, beginning to deduce what you don't.
Yeah, when I'm working with someone else's story, or when my story is being worked with, like I remember a story that I was very vague about. Is I had a few details, of being at a wedding, and it wasn't a whole lot. And as I was working with a really gifted therapist, and as she brought me closer and closer into the memory, by the end of it, I could remember what I was wearing, what shoes I had on, what car we were driving in on the way back. Like it was amazing how much I started with a very vague sense. And so when people talk about not having memory, again, all you need is tell me about what it was like when you came home from school. Oh, well, when I came home from school, no one was there. Okay. What was that like? Was there a snack laid out for you that someone, no, no, no. We had nothing. My mom would buy, cans of Pringles, and that was the thing that I could eat when I got home from school. Okay. Well, now we're heading into some information, right? And our minds and bodies, there's a reason why we don't want to remember. And oftentimes when we don't have memory one way or the other, it's because there's been something that's difficult, that in order for us to engage, it would mean we have to start telling the truth of really difficult things that were happening within our home. And a primary purpose of a child is to keep their parents good in order to be able to stay in relationship. And so to ask a child to start to be honest about what they saw in their mother's mind, or what they saw in their dad's face when they walked down the stairs at prom, like they don't want to know that their dad was checking them out and looking them up and down and taking in their dress and they felt uncomfortable. No 16-year-old wants to know that. So we block out that memory until we say, "Well, do you remember going to prom?" "Oh yeah, I remember going to prom." And their body shivers. So now their body is telling, okay, so now you're tracking and saying, "Well, tell me about why you shivered just then." "Well, I remember walking down the stairs. I felt very uncomfortable." "Well, okay, what does that mean? What did you see? What was uncomfortable about it?" Right? And so it really doesn't take much, if we're open, for us to start to open the floodgates. The deeper question is always, do you want to open them up? And often the answer is no. Until things start to go very, very wrong in people's lives, and they realize they have to do something. That's when a lot of people end up in our offices, or at an intensive, or at a conference, when they're like, "My world's falling apart. I don't understand, but you guys keep talking about story. So, I'm here. My wife made me." And so then again, the invitation is there is healing. There is goodness. There's movement you could make in your life, but you're going to have to start to dig into things that you have wanted to cover over for a long time, for good reason. And then you have to believe that there's something of the goodness of God that is there, as you're willing to be brave and open up the cupboards to see what's actually behind what we've been covering over in our own minds.
And in the examples you give, you're in dialogue with another human being, therapist, friend, another, what Dan, your wife, Becky, often calls trained wise guides. And the question is, what if you didn't have to do this alone? Because the fact is, there's a ceiling on how much you can grow with a cup of coffee, a journal, your Bible, and a good view out the window. You need the body of Christ, i.e., very often another human being or human beings that can walk with you into the gaps in memory, or into the figments of memory that you do remember all too well and don't know what to do with.
And let's go back to the question. So, how about for you, Adam? What has that process brought you?
The biggest word for me, I think, is the word kindness. And what I mean by that right now is an attunement to my heart, my body, and especially my emotions. So when you say your body was like vibrating or buzzing, like for me,
Mm.
the battle is often with my dysregulated affect, is the clinical term for it. In other words, I'm anxious, I'm scared, I'm bearing some measure of shame or humiliation, and my body buzzing is not a bad description. There is an amped up feeling, and my insides are not well. How I have grown and what has been borne so much fruit for me has been noticing that,
Mm-hmm.
just noticing it is so important. And then number two, how, Adam, would you like to respond to the fact that your body is suffering some level of cortisol right now that it was not designed to suffer for an extended period of time? And yet 2 minutes has become 10, has become 2 hours, and I can't settle myself. And so the two words that you've given, Dan, so often are curiosity and kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I have grown in those two words.
Well, and the process feels like a kind of excavation. We're going into ancient sites, and the process is not a matter of bringing a bulldozer and digging. It's such careful, generous, slow work. And as Becky says, you have a food insecurity. We sat and she said, though I know the stories, will you tell me again what it was like to be at dinner? And as soon as she said that, tears came. Like, there's no one on this earth that loves me like my wife, but the generosity of my wife saying, I know the stories, will you tell me again? And part of me was like, I can't do it. I can't. We're good. We're good. I have a food insecurity. I'll resolve it later. At least we know we have dinner. Uh, but again, the presence of a face that's inviting you to a story or stories that have shaped, in many ways, fouled and created bondage. But in that, just being able to share those stories again, and it was so amazing, as you put it, Cathy, there were new stories I've never told anyone that came up that night as I was telling stories I've told quite often before. So the reality of we are an ongoing narrative, even to ourselves. And that part of the invitation here is we're meant to be in community sharing stories, ultimately the story of Christ's death and resurrection and ascension. But in the sharing of that story, it always takes us to our own death and to our own resurrection and to our own ascension and to the realities that are bound into that. I just can't imagine a better life.
Cathy, let me read you something that you wrote, just a sentence. But in light of that image of Becky suffering with Dan as she provoked the question of, would you like to tell me the stories again? Here's what you write. By understanding more of your family of origin story, you can tend to the parts of you that were left behind but are now in need of healing and care. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what do you, because that's what I see Becky doing at the table, is offering her suffering presence in a way that tends to parts that were left behind. But what do you mean by it, Cathy? What does it mean to tend to the parts of you that were left behind?
I think when we experience difficult emotions, we can call it trauma, you can call it heartache, anything that happens when we're little and they're not tended to by an empathetic witness, right? When we have things that happen and parents look away or they say, stop being such a drama queen or, something that, or just aren't available to tend, those things, those experiences, I think get locked in our bodies, waiting for someone to come, waiting for someone to come and find us. And those things, they get corrosive, it gets crowded in there. And I think at some point, right, at some point, we then have the invitation to actually go back and tend. And whether that's someone else tending, whether that's me learning how to tend to my own body, we have to learn how to go back for the parts of us that just didn't get what we needed when we first needed it. And then when we actually are able to tend to those parts now, we actually do experience healing and freedom. And so those parts of ourselves don't have to be locked away forever. But we do need to be willing to retrieve them, which means feeling unfelt feelings that are very uncomfortable and that scare us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to trust that as adults or in different communities, we have the capacity to feel those feelings and have a different result or different reaction because we have community, we have people around us, we have spouses who love us, we have good therapists, we have good people in our corner. I don't know if you've ever gone back to your childhood home or a place that you have a memory of as a kid. But I remember going back to our old house. We lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and I drove past it just a couple summers ago. And I remember the house feeling so huge, and like, I just think it's in my mind, in my 7-year-old mind, it is a massive house. And, it has this huge tree in the front yard, all stuff. And I drive up to it and it is like this tiny little cottage. And it's sweet, it's precious. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my memory of this house is so vastly different than how it feels now. And I think for me, that's what I'm learning in my own story and other people's stories is that when we go back to things that have gotten way bigger in our minds, like if I feel that again, it's going to kill me. When we go back to it as an adult with care, with curiosity, with kindness, we actually can move back through it. And it's not nearly as scary or as awful as we imagine it to be. And so, for me, that quote is, will we allow ourselves to be reparented by ourselves, by those around us, and get the care that we needed back then? We just get it now, and it actually makes a difference. It matters. It changes our neurobiology. It changes our capacity to experience love and goodness and kindness, but not unless we're willing to both identify those places that need tending and then actually allow them to be tended to.
Dan, any thoughts, comments on that before I make a shift?
I love that image of the child who saw the house as huge and the adult who's able to engage it in its rather minuscule form. The reality is our stories are literally a form of writing reality. And so for the reality of a 7-year-old, it's different than the reality of Cathy as an adult woman. But there's such generosity in the way Cathy put it with regard to how the 7-year-old saw the house. And there's no like, oh, that's really disappointing. It's more like, oh, such intrigue, kindness, and curiosity too, what that house meant, what occurred in that house. So it's welcoming even those things within us that are terrifying, knowing that ultimately they are guests that can bring us something that we cannot engage without their presence. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, doesn't mean you have to like them, but to welcome a guest is to indeed listen and to receive and to be willing to be shaped and to find, I think, this sweet sense of redemption. So nothing more.
If you want to listen more deeply to your story, to your past, to the places, the people, the themes, the plot lines of your story, come to Atlanta, Georgia on Saturday, February 3rd, because the three of us are doing a one-day conference on precisely this topic. It's called the StoryWork Conference. It will be held at Trinity Anglican Church, which is on the west side of Atlanta. 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Saturday, February 3rd, 2024. And for those of you that can't make it in person, the conference will be live streamed. So you can sign up and you'll be sent a link to access the live stream. If you're interested, how do you sign up? Go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and the conference information is on the homepage. Also, if you're a therapist type, you can purchase CEUs right from the website. So this episode is in many ways in service to what we will be fleshing out in much more detail on February 3rd. But the premise is that your story matters. It matters. It matters. And it is unique. And by unique, I mean the category of the imago Dei. There is something that you are writing with the choices that you are making in your life. And those choices may have immense heartache in them, but they also bear goodness, glory, and honor. And to engage your story is to look at all of that. And we believe, I mean, Dan, in my opinion, you have pioneered the methodology behind why looking at your family of origin stories, and really we should say plural, because you have many of them, why that process leads to new vistas of freedom, new ways of being in the world, and becoming a co-creator of your life, because you're made in the image of a creator, which means you create. And there's nothing you create that's more powerful than your one, to quote Mary Oliver, your one precious solitary life. So come to Atlanta or come virtually, but your story matters and it's worth it.
All I know is I'm honored by your words, but I love listening the two of you teach. So we haven't fully divided up how we're going to utilize time, but mostly it's going to be a conversation between the three of us. And both of you are some of the very best teachers I've ever known. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from both of you.
Well, I'm excited. It's a privilege to be able to be with you guys on a stage again, and the three of us have never actually taught together, and so this is fun and just a treat. And as always, Dan, it is just the privilege of a lifetime to be on a stage with you. We're just, none of us would have our careers without you and the work that you've done. So we're excited, and Adam, it's always a blast. So I'm excited.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. See you in, actually before then, but see you in Atlanta.